Nonfiction Literature Character Study, Charles Goffin. Read the account below. Consider the questions that follow each passage. You do not need to submit your answers, but use them as a guide for your analysis of this story. From Chapter 8, A Night to Remember, Walter Lord. But one man still lived, thanks to a remarkable combination of initiative, luck, and alcohol. 4 hours earlier, Chief Baker Charles Goffin was awakened, like so many on the Titanic, by that strange grinding jar, and like many others he heard the call to general quarters a little after midnight. But Goffin didn't merely report to the boat deck. He reasoned that if boats were needed, provisions were needed too. So on his own initiative, he mustered his staff of 13 bakers and ransacked the Titanic's larder of all spare bread. The bakers then trooped topside, carrying 4 loaves apiece. This done, Goffin retired to his cabin on E-deck, portside, for a nip of whiskey. About 12:30 he felt sufficiently fortified to reascend the stairs to his boat, number 10. At this stage it was still difficult to persuade the women to go, so Goffin resorted to stronger methods. He went down to the promenade deck and hauled some up by force. Then, to use his own word, he threw them into the boat. Rough, but effective. Goffin was assigned to number 10 as skipper, but he thought there were enough men to handle the boat, so he jumped out and helped it launch instead. To go with it, he explained, would have set a bad example. It was now 1:20. He scampered down the slanting stairs again to his cabin on E-deck and poured himself another drink. He sat down on his bunk and nursed it along, aware but not particularly caring that the water now rippled through the cabin doorway, swilled across the checkered linoleum, and rose to the top of his shoes. About 1:45 he saw, of all people, gentle old Dr. O'Loughlin poking around. It never occurred to Goffin to wonder what the old gentleman was doing way down here, but the proximity of the pantry suggests that Goffin and the doctor were thinking along similar lines. In any case, Goffin greeted him briefly, then went back up to the boat deck. None too soon, for the Titanic was listing heavily now, and the slant was much steeper. Any longer, and the stairs might have been impossible. Though all the boats were gone, Goffin was anything but discouraged. He went down to B-deck and began throwing deck chairs through the windows of the enclosed promenade. Others watched him, but they didn't help. Altogether, he pitched about 50 chairs overboard. It was tiring work, so after he lugged the last chair to the edge and squeezed it through the window, it was a little like threading a needle, Goffin retired to the pantry on the starboard side of A-deck. It was 2:10. As he quenched his thirst, this time it was water, he heard a kind of crash, as though something had buckled. The pantry cups and saucers flew about him, the lights glowed red, and overhead he heard the pounding of feet running aft. He bolted out of the pantry toward the stern end of A-deck, just behind a swarm of people running the same way and clambering down from the boat deck above. He kept out of the crush as much as possible and ran along in the rear of the crowd. He vaulted down the steps to B-deck, then to the well deck. Just as he got there, the Titanic gave a sickening twist to port, throwing most of the people into a huge heap along the port rail. Only Goffin kept his balance. Alert but relaxed, his equilibrium was marvelous, as the stern rose higher and corkscrewed to port. The deck was now listing too steeply to stand on, and Goffin slipped over the starboard rail and stood on the actual side of the ship. He worked his way up the side, still holding on to the rail, but from the outside, until he reached the white-painted steel plates of the poop deck. He now stood on the rounded stern end of the ship, which had swung high in the air some 150 feet above the water. Goffin casually tightened his life belt. Then he glanced at his watch. It said 2:15. As an afterthought, he took it off and stuck it into his hip pocket. He was beginning to puzzle over his position when he felt the stern beginning to drop under his feet. It was like taking an elevator. As the sea closed over the stern, Goffin stepped off into the water. He didn't even get his head wet. He paddled off into the night, little bothered by the freezing water. It was 4 o'clock when he saw that he had what he thought was wreckage in the first gray light of day. He swam over and discovered it was the upturned collapsible B. The keel was crowded and he couldn't climb on, so he hung around for a while until he spied an old friend from the kitchen, entree chef John Maynard. Blood-proof, thicker than water, Maynard held out his hand and Goffin hung on, treading water still thoroughly insulated. The others didn't notice him, partly because they were too numb to care, partly because all eyes now scanned the southeast horizon. It was just after 3:30 when they saw it, a distant flash followed by a far-off boom. Character analysis questions. How has Walter Lord created this non-fiction character in the minds of the readers? What kind of supporting details can you find? What is your first impression of Charles Goffin? Now let's look at the second passage. This is from the amazing story of Titanic survivor Charles Goffin, which is from TitanicUniverse.com. Depicted in both A Night to Remember and the 1997 blockbuster Titanic movie, Charles Goffin is shown as the drunk guy hanging onto the side of the rail. Many individuals may only see the character as a commentary on a certain outlook on the sinking Titanic, but this character actually survived the disaster by warming his insides with whiskey. Those who documented the story of Goffin cite alcohol as one of the contributors to his survival. Along with this cool-headed approach to the situation, documents illustrate that the chef survived longer in the icy Atlantic as a direct result of his blood alcohol level. During the sinking of the Titanic, Goffin and other chefs were tasked with bringing food and supplies to put aboard the lifeboats. Many depictions of Goffin failed to submit this fact and focused more on his excessive drinking. After awaiting his fate in his cabin while hitting the bottle, Goffin ventured onto the top deck and began helping people onto lifeboats and declining to board one himself. Returning to his cabin and further fortifying himself for another half hour, Goffin would later emerge to throw chairs and other items overboard in hopes to give those who fell overboard something to hang on to. After the Titanic had completely been submerged, the story cites that Goffin stepped off of the stern of the ship without as much as getting his hair wet. Accounts say that he survived 3 hours, although the length of time is debated, in the freezing Atlantic. Some say this was a result of the amount of alcohol in his blood, and others have different explanations. No matter how the details read, the fact is that Goffin survived the sinking of the Titanic and managed to keep a level head during the entire disaster. In a letter to the author of A Night to Remember, Walter Lord, Goffin wrote, Mr. Walter Lord, Dear Sir, some secretaries brought to my notice your very splendid article, A Night to Remember, in the current issue of the Ladies' Home Journal. Most written accounts were hair-raising scenes which did not actually occur except in the last few moments when those left behind made a mad rush toward what they considered a safer place, the poop deck. Fortunately, I was all alone when the big list to port occurred. I was able to straddle the starboard rail on A deck and stepped off as the ship went under. I had expected suction of some kind, but felt none. At no time was my head under water, just kept moving my arms and legs and kept in an upright position. No trick at all with a life belt on. Your account of the upturned collapsible with Colonel Gracie aboard was very correct. Most of the crew were familiar with lifeboats and fire stations as they had manned the Olympic, a sister ship, previously. Some curious things are done at a time like this. Why did I lock the heavy iron door of the bakery, stuff the heavy keys in my pocket alongside 2 cakes of hard tobacco? My conclusions of cause of the disaster. Grave error on part of Captain Smith kept course in spite of ice warnings and a severe drop in temperature from 5 p.m. Loss of life. Lifeboat shortage for the number of passengers and crew, but many more could have been saved had the women obeyed orders. In those circumstances, the crew are helpless. Character analysis question. What is your overall impression of Charles Goffin now? How does each author handle him differently? Author's technique question. What did Walter Lord include in his novel that could have been left out? What was left out that he should have included? B. Is Walter Lord's version true to the real story? How has he changed what really happened? Why do you think he made these changes?